because I sure talk a lot and it's just messy. I think the most amazing thing, actually, this is coming from the announcements too, that DSP captioned the video links. They took the YouTube videos that I have uploaded and they, I guess, copied them or something, and were able to then caption them correctly. And so those links now are on the external website. The thing that occurred to me was, I feel bad for the staff at DSP having to sit through, an hour 20 of each of these classes. They have, in many cases, the transcript, but still, to actually have to sit there and transcribe all the stuff and listen to my rambling, I don't know if I would want to do that again myself. So hats off to DSP for doing that. The captioning usually will exist on YouTube regardless, but it's often of not particularly high quality. So it's very helpful that they did that. Other announcements include things like this. The Lab 13 is a B Courses quiz, and my intention there was to have some experience, actually generating something on B Courses that will look like the final in principle. The other things to say before we move on here, and I wanted to poll the class about B Courses versus Gradescope, are that I posted exams from 2016 and 2019, the final exams. That's a little different from what I had discussed with Leslie, because I had found an earlier one, but I think the 2016 is probably better than the one. I think I've had it from like 2013 or something. So the 2016 exam I wrote with the GSIs, the 2019 exam Professor Goldstein wrote with the GSIs. And so it is likely that this year's exam will look more, in terms of the tone and the concepts, look more like the 2016 exam. But the 2019 is useful because the course has changed a bit in its coverage of topics. And I've done my best to cover the same things that Professor Goldstein has covered, and so some of those things they're then in the 2019 and not in the 2016 exam. And also memorably, in 2016 was when I decided that it would be useful to write an empirical question about Major League Baseball, which I thought was fun. I don't know, it was fun to write it. I hope students weren't completely annoyed by it. And so if you read it, you might wonder what in the world you're doing and if I'm crazy. And at the time, I thought it was a useful way of thinking about it was, looking at the data and thinking about time versus cross-sectional variation and how you might disassemble things. And it's also the Bay Area teams. And so, I mean, who doesn't like that? Well, the answer is probably a lot of people, but I enjoyed it. So those are up. Let me pause and see if there are any questions before I run a little poll. Any questions? Okay. So let me try to get this poll going. Oh, is there a question that just came through? Will the exam be 3 hours? So I tried to hedge. I put a post up on Piazza. I don't think it'll be 3 hours long. I think that would be too much. We have a 3-hour time slot technically. We haven't written the exam yet. I think 3 hours in front of a computer would not be something I'd wish upon my worst enemy. So it is not my plan to have a 3-hour exam. And also, the DSP students will, of course, will get their time multiplier. So I don't think it'll be that long. I think it would be more like an hour, hour and a half or something. Other questions? Okay. Actually, let me do the next slide about the schedule here before I do the polling. So we're going to meet today and then next time. And the econ department has asked that we provide some time. It's not dead time. We have a YouTube video to watch that will be urging you to fill out the course evaluations during this class time on Thursday. And the objective, of course, there is to provide you for some time, because we know that this is a favor for us. Filling out the course evaluation, it takes your time. Your time is valuable. And so using some of class time is traditionally the way of getting that done, even though it might seem a little bit weird since you've already decided that you would like to spend this time joining and seeing the material. So I don't know where the policy may be reevaluated, I think, after this term. We'll see. So we'll spend some time doing that. I will hold regular office hours next week during RRR week, and then we'll plan for a live review session during the regular class time, which will also then be recorded, and that'll be on Thursday the 7th, so a week before the final exam. And I haven't fielded this yet, but what I will do is put out a Google Forms questionnaire that will allow you to submit questions so that I can collect them all in one place rather than have them in my inbox and potentially missed. So I think that would be best to do that. And then we'll have the final exam, which will, well, here I've written online on B courses. There was, again, some question about whether B courses is better than Gradescope, or if Gradescope is better than B courses. And so I'll get to that in a second with the poll. And let me just pause and see if there are further questions here. Question from Sartak: is it a scheduled time, or do you take it during the day at your own time? And the answer is, it'll be during the day at your own time. There are people on, students on the other side of the globe, for example, and you don't have to wake up at the crack of, well, whatever it would be, like 1 in the morning or something. So I'll finalize that more, but if you have some constraints, you should get in touch with me, but the objective would be to have it available during a roughly 24-hour period. Another question from Kevin: can we make it Wednesday to Thursday for people to take the earlier exam if needed? I think we could probably do that. Okay, and yeah, I guess a good question is, and I haven't thought much about it, is whether it's before or after the usual time that we have, which is, I believe, 3 to 6 on that Thursday, technically, which is set aside. So the objective will be to make it possible for everybody to do it during the time that is formally set aside for you, because that means that your other classes won't be competing for your time during that slot, but also to have broader flexibility there. And, you know, we're all on our honor. This concern has been raised by some students in the past about the honor code and, you know, exam shenanigans. And you know, the bottom line is, I trust all of you. That's what it has to be, and that's where we are. And there'll be an honor code to sign effectively with a click or something. So we're aiming for flexibility around the time, and I understand. Okay, so somebody has 2 finals on that Thursday and would like to have it available earlier, and that's fine. And so the rules are, you know, you take the exam, and you know, please keep it to yourself. That's the way it's going to be. I think another question on Piazza had arisen: is it open book and open note? And sure, we can have it be that way. The objective is not that you will need your books or notes, but yeah, you can have open book, open note, probably open internet, I think. And the objective is just that you'll have a set amount of time, which won't be a ridiculously tight time constraint to get it done. Okay, other questions? Okay, so let me, well, I could, yeah, I didn't actually do a current events slide here, but let me try to pull up my polling. So let's start this, and I wonder how is this going to appear? Oh, maybe both are shown at the same time. I'm hoping this is, can people see the poll? Looks like somebody has voted. As you can see, I'm a little bit ham-handed here with how I'm able to do this, but I'm hoping that you'll weigh in about your opinions regarding B courses quizzes and Gradescope quizzes. Somebody is saying that they have never had a Gradescope quiz. Yeah, that part of the problem is I've never written a Gradescope quiz. I don't think it's going to be hard to do it. The concern that I had seen raised among faculty was that students are familiar with B courses and they're not as familiar with Gradescope. And so, you know, we don't want to pull the rug out from underneath you. So how are we looking at with our responses here? And if the TAs could try to, if the GSIs could please help me sort of filter this through, if you can see. Oh, I bet I have to hit end poll, right? Leslie, can you see the results? You might be able to because you're a co-host.
Yeah, I can see them.
You can see them, okay. Let's go ahead and close polling. I think people are largely done. Looks like we don't have votes from everybody, but from most people. Okay, so now let me, okay, so I'm seeing a bunch of useful things coming through in the chat. Now if I hit end poll, if I hit share results, maybe that'll show it to everybody. Okay, so, I mean, it looks like some people didn't vote. I'm not sure what to make of this exactly. I don't think there's overwhelming feeling really either way. I will dig through the chat to assess what people are saying about this. Um, maybe what is best is to just take a beat and say, I think what the GSIs need and I need to do is think about your feedback here offline, and then make this a, you know, an evolving conversation that we'll get back to you about this. Alexander is writing a comment that's really interesting. Any chance of a format similar to last time? I felt that went smoothly. What do you mean by a format similar to last time? As in printout. Oh, okay, like the midterm. Okay. So some people are saying that they'd rather have like a midterm style thing, and then Sarah's saying no, not one of those. Not ever. Okay. So I think we need to stick to the plan of an online kind of exam. I think that would be best. We announced that far in advance. I understand the desire to be able to print it out and write it out or something, and I get that. But I think we're going to stick to a multiple choice exam. So why don't I go ahead and Chad is so darn funny. Oh, you kids these days. This is exactly what I hope I would be able to do if I were in your position, 20 years ago when the pandemic had hit, and the long, long ago of 1896 or whatever it was when I was in college. So we'll try to digest your remarks offline and get back to you. I will have to say I don't think the we hate B courses is shared by everybody, but I understand that some people I think do kind of hate B courses. And I think there also was a remark in the chat about the format, whether it's all one page versus multiple pages. And so we'll review those thoughts that you all have. And overall, number one, just thank you for the feedback, because we wouldn't really know otherwise. So it's very helpful to see these remarks. So let's stop that sharing, and now here we go. Let me just do this just for kicks. And so why don't I launch this fun poll? What do people think about this? I tried to reproduce what I had done earlier, and then of course I couldn't find the results, and I'm not sure that they're actually in the video to begin with. But as you might imagine, when I asked this early on, in the long, long ago, that was March. I think that's when it was. I think a lot of folks were still fairly nearby, and I think that may well have changed quite a bit. Of course, you might imagine that we're going to see quite a bit of sampling bias here, right? And sampling bias, of course, is kind of the big name of the game these days, when we're all wondering about COVID-19 positives, and how do you know what the prevalence of COVID-19 is? Well, you have to measure it in people. Well, the problem is you have to assess whether or not the people who are in your sample are representative or not. One of the big challenges with the question that I'm asking like this, it's clear that there are many students who are overseas, but they are likely not present. So they're not in the sample. And so we're seeing a 6%. I'll go ahead and end the poll and then show it to you here. That 6%, so 4 students are overseas, and my hat is off to you. Or you might be in the same time zone. So overseas, of course, is usually what we say when we mean not in the United States, but of course you could be in Canada or Mexico, or you could presumably imagine South America being effectively, linked by land. But of course, nobody actually drives from South America up to the United States. Or if you do, my hat is off to you, because that would be a super awesome drive, but I'm not even sure you can do it. So it looks like, many folks are in California who are joining us. And then some people are in the Bay Area too. So as I usually try to say, and probably don't say often enough, thank you for joining. It really makes a huge difference to have you here, rather than just speaking into a void, which is not something I would wish my worst enemy to have to do. Okay, so there's my polling for today. Didn't do current events. I'm sure there was something crazy that the administration did. Somebody's in London. That's pretty cool. New Zealand. Wow, that's awesome. New Zealand really has just been gangbusters, right? I mean, I think they had a much more significant lockdown, but the news out of New Zealand is that the transmission rate, which is often the way one measures this, whether it's 1 or below 1, meaning that one person infects one other person, and I think in New Zealand it's far below 1 right now, which is a huge success. That combined with, of course, the automatic weapons ban, or I'm not going to get that right, but the gun control issue was another thing that it seems like the New Zealanders were rather far ahead of us, the United States. Actually, of course, these are very different countries, just geographically speaking, of course, but also the population is much different, but also differently sized. But I have a great affinity for New Zealand, never having visited, but we had a sublet once in New York who was an academic from New Zealand, and she was really awesome. So I'm just impressed with most things New Zealander, including of course the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Right, everybody has to say that, which is true. All right, so why don't we go ahead and kind of begin the class material, which I think we have a fair amount to get through here. So today we're going to talk about the Preston curse here in number 4. The knowledge and technology are key for populations, and processing knowledge is important for individuals. So the part of that that's in red is the story about the Preston curve, which will come up in a bit. The other big points, so we kind of covered the first one last class, but we'll touch on it again. And you know, one way, I guess, of sort of reformulating, you know, where we have been and where we're going with all this. The big story in general is that there are large SES differences or socioeconomic status differences in health. Or you could say there's a gradient in health across socioeconomic status. Excuse me, a really big one is education. And the reason that in number 2, I say education is probably better for measuring this. It's true that there's some reverse causality, that if you're sick when you're a kid, you might not complete as much schooling as usual. And that's especially true in developing countries where kids are subject to just a whole ton of awful things that can really make them very sick and really also just degrade learning. Like, you know, we're talking about like hookworms and other awful things that, you know, suck nutrition out of you. So there is that, but generally the problem with income gradients in health is that you really don't know which one's causing which, because usually the health outcome is at adult ages. There are a couple of problems. One is that your income, you know, past retirement, well, what does that mean? It's a pension, it's a reflection of earlier stuff, which I guess is good, but the earnings that you might have or not have, you know, that's a function of how healthy you are. If you're able to keep working, if you have an occupation where you can keep working, then you're going to have more income. So that's part of the problem there. It's still a useful way of cutting the data, and we'll see that later today, hopefully, or possibly on Thursday rather. Other points here are that, you know, health insurance is important, and I guess to some extent that topic will arise maybe next time we talk about Ann Case and Angus Deaton's work. You know, you would think it may be more important. It turns out not so much, at least not when you look at countries like the UK, where there is universal health insurance. We're talking about New Zealand, and I think the same is probably true there, that there's universal health insurance, at least much more so than in the United States, but you still see health disparities. In New Zealand, of course, one of the big stories is the Maori versus the non-Maori populations, the indigenous versus the Anglo or, you know, the white populations. You know, they're different, and that's a big part of the deal in the United States for sure. But as we'll see more next time, another big part of what's happening in the United States is big differences among white Americans, white non-Hispanics, and the deaths of despair that are associated with the opioid crisis and suicide and drinking and mortality and all kinds of wonderful things. We have to keep trying to keep an optimistic, you know, take on stuff, and that's hard sometimes here. So the bottom lines then are at the bottom of these learning objectives here is, you know, think about policies that, you know, expand insurance, increase income. Okay, and the problem is that it's not obvious that those are really going to eliminate these, and so maybe we need to harness something else, generating knowledge that people are aware of. And I think, yeah, there are just big question marks in this field, as we'll see next time, and it has to do with one of the big emerging problems, which is addiction at middle age, painkillers, feelings of loss of empire, I think, are the things that sometimes come to my mind about what's happening in white America right now. Oh, okay, so we have to keep things light, right? I don't know, it's impossible these days, I guess, but you know, this is a gateway to much bigger and more interesting and better things of health economics. And if you're joining me for Econ 157 in June, we'll hopefully touch on more of those. And this is one of the sort of the capstone tools there, the Grossman model of health capital. But in having taught it now for several years, I would say it's not really as transparent or as sort of blatantly useful in our thinking, or what, I don't know, fungible, or it's it's not a thing you whip out and actually explain everything with. And the Solo model is really good at that sort of thing. If you want to explain the differences between rich and poor countries, or the differences over time in rich countries or in poor countries, either one, the Solo model is really fantastic. The Grossman model is useful, but it's less transparent. We're going to talk about theories of health inequalities, and you can get at them with the lens of the Grossman model, but not in a particularly obvious way. And so I don't have plans to ask about a lot of these not very obvious things in the final exam. I think it is useful to think about capital in the Solo model as being similar to this concept of health capital in the Grossman model. There's depreciation. You have to make investments over time. What do the investments look like? Well, there are your healthy time, time not spent working, time spent on yourself, exercising. Maybe it's time spent interacting with people, so your psychological health is better. There's an opportunity cost to being healthy, and it's the wage, because usually the things that we engage in to make money are not really making us healthy. They might make you feel satisfied. I suppose that's possible, and that's, I think, a goal. It's why all of us probably are in school, to to be able to find a career that actually makes us feel mentally better when we're making lots of money. But then you think about what you might do if you do make a lot of money in your job. You might go and eat too many steaks and drink too much wine or something, and spend it all on things that you shouldn't be spending it on. And that's kind of one of the problems, especially I would say in the United States, where we tend to work really hard and do crazy things to relieve our stress afterward. So underneath it all, there are these pieces that are universal, I think, in C175: opportunity costs, wages matter, the value of time, and what you do with it. Just like in the fertility model, that you can either use your time to raise a family and draw utility from your kids, or you could use your time in the market and make more money, and that also brings you utility. And so the issue is, what are the trade-offs that you face, and how do you make those choices? All right, so we saw this last time. Then you get this downward sloping, effectively like a demand curve, if you like, for health capital, where the vertical axis is sort of like a price. It's actually a rate of return. And the supply curve, if you like, is kind of this horizontal thing at the level of, it turns out, the market interest rate, which seems silly. But again, the objective to think of this as, well, you've got other uses of your cash, and you could be investing in health capital, or you could be investing in physical capital, and you would earn little r, which is the physical capital interest rate. Right? Sounds crazy, but in these models of the 1960s and 1970s, crazy things were happening. I guess we were able to suspend disbelief a little bit more. The thing that isn't so crazy is this little gamma here, which is the rate of depreciation of your health. So a lot of the stories we are going to have actually have to do in this model with the demand curve, if you like, for health capital, the marginal efficiency of capital. This demand curve, a lot of the stories have to do with that. Some of them, however, have to do with this, the supply curve. And the way to think about that is that if you're blessed with a lower rate of health depreciation, which some of us seem to be, then you might end up with a higher optimal stock of health capital. And that's showing up in this model then as, a reduction in this gamma term would push the whole supply curve down. You'd end up at a higher optimal level of health capital and a higher, longer lifespan. That's the way to think about this, that health capital translates into length and also quality of life. Usually those things are related, although not always. And so there's more to be said about that, I guess. But if you had a lower rate of depreciation, it would be more worth your while to spend more investing in your health capital rather than other opportunities. Because the problem is, if the stuff is, if gamma is really high, the benefits of investing in your health capital are not as great as they normally would be. You'd be probably better off investing in some other things, doing other things with your time. And that's, I think, kind of a subtle point about all this, is that you do what you can with what you've got. How could we improve the lives of people? A lot of people, I think I just used two synonyms there. How could we improve people's lives who are choosing a low level of health capital in this model? And the answer could be, give them more something. give them more time if that were possible, time in the day, or splitting it across different home workers or something. If there other people were able to take care of children, for example, if co-resident grandparents could do it, then that person would have more time to spend on their health, to exercise regularly, for example, or to go to the doctor for checkups. And that's real, right? There are real time costs out there that are penalizing some people who just don't have the time to go for checkups or to get out and enjoy the sunny day, for sure. And I think that's the way of thinking about this: is that people are doing the best they can, and sometimes that's going to mean that they're going to effectively choose a level of health capital that maybe is low. How could policy think about improving their lives? Well, it could try to relax those constraints in some ways. So in many cases, we'll have something to say about the level of this MEC curve. And we have a bunch of different hypotheses that sort of step through this. And let me just say before we jump into all these that the way most health economists talk about this is usually not referencing this graph of the Grossman model. And that's actually different, I think, than the way most development economists would talk about the aggregate effects of development. They probably would refer to the SOLA model, which is more universal and more transparent. So we're going to, again, use the Grossman model to talk about these things intelligently, and that's the learning objective. That's what we look for on the final exam, is to be able to think a little bit about the different components that go into people's production of good health. And one of them, for example, is this first one, that people are maybe more efficient producers of health if they are more educated. Now, the exact mechanism there, of course, is a little weird. Anyway, so we'll step through all these, but let me just dive in, because I don't think it's useful to just enumerate them all and dazzle you with how there are all these different ones. That's true. This is one of the big ones, is that more education certainly is associated with better health. And the head scratcher, of course, is why is that? Well, there's reason to think that people who complete degrees and go to college and go for further education past that are able to get something out of the whole experience that other people are not able to do. So maybe again, we're revealing that people are different, and those who are more patient. So that's going to be the Fuchs hypothesis at the end. Maybe people who are more patient are able to synthesize information from wacky people like me, college professors, and they're also able to synthesize information maybe from doctors who try really hard to to kind of scale their advice to everyone who comes in the door. But they're still doctors. They still have, on average, something like 18 years of education or 19 years of education compared to the population average, which is more like maybe 13 or so. They're different folks, right? The doctors are just different from people who they usually are seeing in offices. And that's also true, of course, about the trained nurses in healthcare and all kinds of different people in the health force. Generally, those folks are more highly trained than kind of the average person in the population. Of course, they're differently trained as well. So the issue is, how do you interface with this system? And the suggestion is that you're more efficient in interfacing with doctors and nurses and listening to advice, taking the things that you think are really useful in what they say, which of course sometimes is sort of like a fire hose, and it seems to result in actual improvements. So there is a study that suggests this is real. If you're required to be in school for an extra year, that's called compulsory schooling. And a very smart person who's now at, I think, UCLA, Adriana Yeras-Muni, had written this influential paper that seemed to show this. At the beginning of the 20th century, birth cohorts in say the 1910s, I think, who were treated in this way, who were required to stay in school an extra year or two relative to what previously people had been required to do. So it's based off a comparison of different birth cohorts that are next to each other. And she finds that there seems to be this big change, this big increase in longevity, an improvement in health associated with having stayed in school longer. Well, the first one that I have, one of the reasons here, lessons in school help students to take better care of themselves. Did you guys have health in school, like the health class? I remember I did. You guys remember having that? Did any of it make you do anything other than just giggle? Just make jokes with your friends? I mean, I maybe it does. There's basic. You took health online in high school. Well, that's probably safer for not just breaking out into chuckles and giggles each time. That's, I think, all I did. But of course, I maybe wasn't always the sort of smartest or most dedicated student there. So, I mean, I think this is plausible that this can work. But once you get into high school, so this is like elementary school, I think, wasn't it? Or maybe junior high, I'm thinking of. It's plausible. I'm a little bit dubious about that sort of thing. I guess I think probably the second and third bullets are more plausible here, that schooling helps people be more patient. You have to be to get through school. A lot of school is pretty boring. And there's a remark about anti-vaxxers and who of them actually have college degrees. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if anybody's done that, but it does turn out that, anti-vaxxing is a little bit of it's like a club. You'd be surprised who's in the club. And the reason is maybe none of your friends are anti-vaxxers, but the trick is that many of the anti-vaxxers' friends are also anti-vaxxers. It appears to be kind of a, let's have a club and, we're all going to be anti-vaxxers. And, I just wish it were a little bit more, harmless. It doesn't seem particularly harmless to me, unfortunately, but at least the story on that has largely changed in California anyway, with changes in the ways that people get these the get out of jail free cards, if you like, the requirements to have your kids vaccinated or not. And it used to be a lot easier to do that. It's not as easy anymore. More likely to adhere to treatment regimens is the fact. I guess you might wonder, what does this really mean, and why do better educated people actually adhere to treatment regimens? And I think the answer is that, one thing you can say is they're talking to peers when the treatment regimens are laid out by doctors. And you have to believe that the doctor has your best interest at heart and isn't just telling you to ruin your life over something silly. When I was about 30, my doctor told me I had to lose whatever it was, 15 or 20 pounds. It was a decent amount of weight. And I don't know why, but it was scary, I guess. And I believed him. He was a doctor and he seemed intelligent, and I did it. And I came back and I said, well, I did it. And he's like, really? Get on the scale. And I did. And he looked at me and he said, I tell everybody to do that and nobody ever does. And there too, so there's heterogeneity here. It's also possible, of course, that he had a lot of patients who weren't like me for whatever reason. And, one of the reasons could be education is different there. So, so that's what we can say. Is it a causal thing? And that's partly of what Lab 13 got into. It could just be that what you're seeing is, people who have more schooling are more advantaged, generally speaking. And again, I guess I keep thinking about the Fuchs hypothesis. The last thing that we're going to mention here is that, maybe you learn to be more patient. Well, why are you more patient? Well, maybe your parents had more time because they were more advantaged. So they weren't always at work and they were able to sit with you. And so they were there to say, no, you can't watch TV. You have to sit here and play with something or talk to me. Maybe that's the treatment. So it's a problematic area here, but we suspect there's probably some causal part of schooling, but part of it also just might be revealing something underneath it all. I think if you're like me, another big challenge here is why are health disparities there? And the problem is that there are a lot of arguments in a variety of ways about how these things might cut. And that's the sad truth. I think there's more black and white stuff about, say, the macroeconomics of development, and much less black and white stuff about micro issues like this. And that's, I think, what one often finds in any sort of applied setting. Okay, and so here's something in the chat about mental health. That's very, it's useful to raise that as something that's separate here. And I don't know what is known about education and mental health. That's a really good question. Yeah, so I don't know. That might be a very interesting senior honors thesis, for example. All right, so moving on. Here's another one, and here, so I've been thinking a lot about this just because there's an influential paper. Let's see where it showed up in the slides, if it did, by Doug Almond, who actually looks at the long-term impacts triggered by the 1918 flu epidemic. So there, for obvious reasons, we're thinking about it again today. You might think that genes might get turned on or off differently depending on early life and especially in utero conditions. Their argument is that if your mother is deprived of resources or is stressed, those things might program you when you're in the womb. And you might end up getting thrifty genes that are very useful if you were born into an environment that was permanently deprived. So think about the long evolution of humans here. And if your mother was part of a tribe that was, I don't know, on the outs with the local tribes or something, and you guys are all moving around and you're always under threat of being killed by saber-toothed tigers or something, you might have these thrifty genes that are extremely good at, I don't know, getting you really hungry really quickly. And so you eat lots of food right when you can because the saber-toothed tiger is about to come and eat you, something like that. And the problem is that with modern society, in large part, those sorts of genes aren't great. It's better to have genes that aren't so thrifty, that recognize that you're going to have a long lifespan over which to accumulate nutrition and various things, and you don't have to rush through stuff. I'm kind of making all this up about the whole eating fast garbage. So don't take that part to heart. What you should take to heart is this argument that you might end up with a genetics setting, if you will. It's not really your genes, but it's which of them kind of get triggered and turned on, if you like, that make you predisposed to diabetes, obesity, and other things later in life. And this seems to be fairly real. There's a huge difference in the rate at which folks are diabetic across SES groups, and you see it in African Americans in particular. And of course, it's associated with lower socioeconomic status among African Americans, but you also, I believe, you see it across the gradient, say, within white non-Hispanics, in addition to that. So that's a real and a challenging thing. You could also step back and say that what happens early in life generally is important for what happens later. It doesn't have to necessarily be the in utero programming, but this is something that's gotten a lot of attention for obvious reasons because people love genetic stuff, and it's the sort of cutting edge of what we can measure. So some natural experiments try to look at this sort of thing. And again, one of them is actually a classmate of mine here at UC Berkeley in the economics department. Got his PhD, and he wrote about this. The differences that you might see between these birth cohorts that were in utero during the influenza epidemic in 1918 and the other birth cohorts right on the other side of them. And so that's one way of kind of assessing this, that you might want to look at people who otherwise would be similar except for this treatment in utero and kind of see what happened. And his answer was that the people who were in utero during the influenza epidemic of 1918 were worse off. They died earlier, and that's sobering for sure. So selection biases obviously are a problem, but if you can plausibly look at something that was exogenous, like the influenza epidemic, even there's a real problem, of course, with the way that different groups are likely to have been treated differently because of their behaviors during the epidemic. But I think knowing Doug Almond, he probably stepped through it in some plausible way. Here's another example, though, of how you might examine this sort of thing. If you were to look at the Dutch babies that were conceived after this famine that was triggered by a blockade during World War II, and compare those to the babies conceived during the famine, that seems like a pretty clean sort of thing. It is also true, of course, that you'd have to believe that the parents are not differentially planning when to get pregnant or not when to get pregnant, right? I mean, and here, I think, harkening back to the earlier part of 175, that there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that the people are actually pretty good at planning how many kids to have and when to have them. even if they didn't have, cheap contraception, it's obviously a lot easier when you have the contraceptive pill, for sure. But the point is, right, that during this period, it's likely to be the highly educated, wealthy Dutch families who actually were able to kind of plan, right, and were aware of what to do, and transmitted some knowledge and possibly squirreled away some technology to actually do this sort of thing. So I apologize for for basically poking holes and stuff. I think these studies are peer reviewed, so the first thing we should take away from them is that this is a pretty good way of assessing the effect of trauma in utero, basically of reduction in nutrition, and do things like higher rates of diabetes and obesity compared to the children who were born a little bit later. And so the way you'd want to do this is to look at the birth cohorts of kids then and hope that the characteristics of their parents are the same as the kids then who were born after the famine. And I think if there were, then what I just said about, contraceptive technology and all that stuff and access to it is probably not as salient anymore, because if you actually looked at the parents and they're basically all the same, right? The variation was the same, then you'd have to say, look, they're not getting anything different out of their parents. And so now let's look at the rates of diabetes and obesity. And the research basically says that, these folks who are deprived in utero end up with higher rates of diabetes and obesity. They had these thrifty genes turned on. And that's a sad and, it's a sad thing. I think one of the big points here about health inequalities is to have great empathy for people who have different health outcomes and different longevity. I think there's a tendency among, it's not the college educated, so it's not Berkeley students who would ever say this, but there's a great tendency, I think, among the public to say things like the following. The reason that people die too early is they have bad diets and they do not exercise, and therefore they get what they deserve. Stark and not a lot of sympathy. Now, I don't think you would hear that in other countries as much, but I think in the United States, that's one of the prevailing views. And of course, you could say that the psychology of it is underneath it all, and that this will tie into this next time also, that underneath it all, I think you might find that the groups who are saying things like that, who are not particularly in the business of empathy, those groups themselves have, economic and health situations that are not great, or their families have situations that are not great. They might know somebody who has addiction problems, for example, or who is overweight and can't stop, binge eating or something like that. And so they have hardened their worldview to say, well, it's, this is a bad thing and I'm going to be against this, and point it out and say, well, that's the reason why people suffer these inequalities. Well, here's a real obvious way in which, the inequalities that some people suffer is not through any behavior of their own. It's not their fault. I mean, you can't imagine anything more stark than that. Is when you had you were unlucky enough to be in utero during a famine or during an epidemic. So a big part of health economics is finding out where the line to draw here is, and I tend to try to err on the side of empathy, because I think that's where it ought to start, and then from there one can take perhaps more hard-headed perspectives on things. All right, so speaking of hard-headed perspectives, I think, does income matter? The thing about income is not only does it mean money in your pocket, it also means the ability to get the money in your pocket. And that then leads us into something we'll talk more about next time, which is labor market opportunities. So I think there's more to it if you view this as sort of a lifetime of labor market opportunities and sort of social ability, if you like, or social standing. I think that has much more traction in my mind. Having more cash on hand, it's not obvious to me that that's going to help, but there's clear debate about that. And I think I saw the headline but didn't dive into it. I think our Speaker of the House, whose district is right over here in San Francisco, Nancy Pelosi, I think had made some remark about universal basic income, which is something that has been talked about. I think, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and other folks on the left side of the party, the Democratic Party, have been talking about it for some time. And I think it will gain more traction, especially in this time when there's a significant share of the population that is unemployed and basically receiving universal basic income through the unemployment insurance system. And that will eventually dry up, and we don't know yet what's going to happen after that. So with all that said, I guess I think that for me, the things that really are meaningful here is to think about the long-term lifetime access to labor markets and the ability to trade your time for money. And that would be a good thing. It's not too clear that just having more resources would actually end up getting you better off. But here in the slide anyway, we've traced through one way in which that might happen. But let me just say, the trend that I find very convincing of literature in health economics that suggests actually just having extra cash on hand might not really be good. Here's a study in 2012 by Evans and Moore that looked at within-month mortality, and it finds that there's elevated mortality after the first of the month when paychecks arrive. And so they argue that this is the issue. It's cash on hand and economic activity. And what do we mean by that? Well, it's code for, doing things you shouldn't be doing with your money because you happen to have a lot of money in your pocket, especially for people who maybe have a hard time either, planning to hold on to the money, or they don't have access to bank accounts, or they have family members who are going to steal the money, or they have other members of the neighborhood who are going to steal it or something. And so you might need to kind of get rid of it quickly in some way that benefits you. And it turns out that, visits to the emergency department and hospitals and all that tends to rise rather strongly around these times of check disbursement, unfortunately. More broadly, there's this literature that had been started by Chris Room and other folks have written about it as well, that mortality appears actually to rise during good economic times. In other words, during business cycle expansions, when the stock market is doing well and unemployment is very low, mortality is actually temporarily higher, usually. Now, one might be tempted to say something about what might be happening right now during the pandemic lockdown because of that. And I'll just say this. One of the mechanisms there is that there are far more traffic fatalities during times that are economically very busy. And if you shut down the economy, there are going to be far fewer traffic fatalities. And so that's a good thing. But, it's not obvious that you want to shut down the whole economy, obviously. It's not obvious, obviously. I hate when I do that. I typed in a quote of somebody else who did that same thing. I just repeated two words right next to each other, and that's just happened. So that'll show up in the in the closed captioning the DSP will provide it, and I'll just laugh and hang my head and say, well, I'll do better next time. Long-term increases in income then might need to derive from education, the tax code, health insurance, premia, and reassessing how much people pay for that. But also access to labor markets, and that will be one of the stories we'll talk about next time. The allostatic load hypothesis then is another one, and allostatic load means wear and tear. So it's the sort of thing that you are repeatedly exposed to over time, and you could call it stress. And what we imagine then is that this wear and tear basically leads to a higher rate of health capital depreciation. There are biomarkers of allostatic load, of wear and tear, that I'm trying to remember which this one is now, C-reactive proteins, I think, that usually show up in blood that are a biomarker, meaning an indicator that you can measure in something. That's what a biomarker is, something living, right? You could see a biomarker, for example, in chimps or apes or humans, a variety of things. We'll get to those in a second. And there's real evidence of this, and here's a good example of it then. So and I wonder, I know there's a New Zealander in the audience, and I wonder, I don't remember exactly what the story is in the UK with what Whitehall means, but I think Whitehall is traditionally where a lot of the bureaucrats were housed. There's Downing Street, right, where the Prime Minister is, and of course, famously, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, was in the ER with, I think he was on oxygen, not on a ventilator, but he was on oxygen with COVID-19. So he just came out and gave some speech in front of Downing Street. Is that 10 Downing Street? Or anyway, I don't know. And it reveals, right? We always have this shorthand for our own country. The White House, of course, here in the United States means where the president and first family live. The White Hall, I think, is a place where British bureaucrats or British civil servants, I guess bureaucrats is sort of a pejorative here, but that's where they are. This was a series of studies by Michael Marmot and other, oops, that's a typo. Marmot et al. Is the Latin, not at all, sorry. And it's a series of studies in which what he does is look at the health status of British civil servants. They're very homogeneous in terms of their access to health insurance. Everybody is universally covered ever since World War II by the National Health Service in Britain. And also they share workplace environments, they share locations. Now, of course, the difference is that, and if anybody who's ever watched a British situation comedy, like in the original version of The Office, anybody who's watched that knows, of course, there's big differences between the classes of workers, between the managers and the people who are more directly proximate to the actual production of work. Right, famously, I mean, so folks probably, in fact, during lockdown, right, everybody has watched The Office, the American version. You should also watch the British version if you are very interested in sarcasm and depressing British humor, because that's what it is consistent of, I would say. The American version, The Office is a great show, and it'll always be there for you. That's the best part. It's like if you're ever bored and there's nothing else on, just go over and watch The Office. It's great. The thing about the American version is it's more attuned to our taste, which tends to be more sort of happily ever after at the end of the story. That's the way Americans seem to like their fiction, and they don't like the the sad and despondent sort of pessimistic view of how things never change, which is more traditionally present in British versions of things. And that's definitely what you see in the British version of The Office, where the Michael Scott character is David Brent, I think. And he's just a pompous moron. He's really a goofball. Michael Scott started off that way in the American version, but didn't end up that way, not at all. He turned out into this really, sweet, but totally silly, goofy, I mean, he's still a moron, but he's a really silly guy. And that's not at all the way that David Brent originally was. I think he evolved that way, is the thing he managed to come back in other forms. Okay, long side note there, but I can't resist, just because, you have to take the humor in all this, because we're talking about health inequalities. What the Marmot studies here then revealed were that if you were a low person on the totem pole, as we say in the United States, probably should avoid that because it references Native American totem poles in the Pacific Northwest. If you're a low person on the ladder, if you're down at the bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum within the British civil service, you ended up with more job stress and with higher mortality rates, in particular from cardiovascular disease, heart disease. And of course, that's the biggest killer. But then it's useful to know, in fact, that you were more likely to be killed by that because you were low on the ladder. You were down at the bottom of the spectrum of authority there. And if you watch the British Office, you'll see it's there's a lot of sadness going on down there. And it's not just in humans. So here's the next slide then, where it turns out that you would see this sort of thing apparently among the baboon troops, not that I've ever experienced this firsthand, but that there would be these dominant baboons up at the top of the hierarchies. And it turned out that these were associated, and I hope the baboons weren't hurt tremendously by this, but you can usually do this sort of testing with a pinprick. This is a biomarker here of high density lipoprotein, which I believe is that's the good cholesterol here. Luckily, I've got it on the slides. There's bad cholesterol and good cholesterol, and it turns out that the folks on the top would have more of this good cholesterol. And why? Well, if you're at the top of the baboon hierarchy, I mean, that seems sort of obvious, right? That watch a Disney movie and there's always like a king or a queen of the animal community and they're in really great shape. Then there are all these little, very angry little evil characters, right? That are always at the bottom of the hierarchy trying to subvert the system or something. But, it makes a lot of sense that if you're animals, you're pounding each other, whatever it is. With humans, it was a little bit less obvious, but it's also kind of plausible that it would manifest itself in human circles in addition. All right, baboons, always fun. Okay, then you could tie it into income inequality. And this has been done with various degrees of success, but the way the story might go is that in a society, a human society with more income inequality, it's more obvious that there are other people who are earning more than you, and it may not seem particularly socially just a lot of the time. And that might be stressful. I think as you travel through your lives, you may well notice this. I think I noticed it even back in high school and college that, there was a hierarchy. There were people who were different and people who were richer or less rich, in all these dimensions. And you might wonder, well, does that cause you additional stress or allostatic load will tear on your body because you're worried about this sort of thing? I think it depends a little bit on your personality. I might have said yes, I'm not really sure. One of the problems with this theory is that you can find data on income inequality. It's getting better with more time, but a lot of the early studies used really bad data. And so this was Angus Deaton's point that if you look at the data sets that have been used in testing this, it just is not at all convincing. It seems more like the relationship between mortality and income was effectively just a linear sort of thing. It wasn't any kind of thing that would reflect income inequality mattering in some obvious way. I don't think necessarily the book is closed on this, but it's a theory that's out there. I think basically we need to remain sort of agnostic at this point. Here's an access to care hypothesis that more health insurance and affording more health insurance and also lower prices per visit would be a good thing. And that's clear that it differs across people and it probably matters. But having said that, even in countries that have universal health insurance and universally low prices, you still see health disparities. So it doesn't mean that there aren't disparities in access here, let's say in the United States, where there are health disparities. There are, and they're important. But I think what emerges when one thinks about this in some systematic way is that it doesn't appear to be a real obvious silver bullet. That if one were to somehow restrict everybody to the same level of access to care. So, and this is a big political thing now too, in health insurance reform, in Obamacare or Medicare for all, and any of these sorts of things. One of the big questions is, do you require everybody, say, to go to Medicare in the United States? What about people who have more generous health insurance plans? This is an issue in the United Kingdom where I think it is legal to purchase additional insurance on top of what you get from the publicly provided health insurance, but it's controversial. And the problem is that you're not going to get buy-in then politically from groups that have lots of income or wealth if they view potentially losing health insurance through this. And the other wrinkle is that it's not always wealthy people who have really good health insurance. It's also some working class people too. Most notably, it would be police and fire. So firefighters and police officers and the military would also be a group that I think would qualify here. There are some people who make a lot of money in those groups, but by and large, those groups are not wealthy groups. They are compensated with very generous health insurance. So what do you do? They're not the evil robber baron billionaires who are just hosing people. They have particular occupations where healthcare traditionally has been valued a lot more than among other occupations. So what do you do with that? That's a big problem for reform, or at least maybe I should say problem, a big topic, a big challenge to be addressed. So here's a reverse causality hypothesis, and I wish I'd written that here in the title, but you can see it in the first bullet, that the productive time hypothesis is a story about differences in socioeconomic status reverse caused by disparities in early health, which then also cause disparities in later health. And for example, you might think malaria exposure in utero, this is the bottom bullet here, Hookworm exposure. Hookworm is an awful thing because it gets into your body and then it absorbs all kinds of nutrients, and it leaves you less healthy because even though you consume these nutrients, the problem is the hookworms actually are absorbing a ton of them, and it's just a very bad thing. Here in the middle, this was another classmate actually of ours, Doug Allman, and this is Phil Oreopoulos with the study about siblings growing up in the same household, and some who had just a worse health outcome. Be interesting to look at this study to examine to what extent it's correlated with birth order, because often it's the firstborn is in best health and is the tallest, but I think they were likely to have looked at these random health shocks. It could have been like a physical accident or something like that, or it could have been some other kind of, you would think it probably would have to be a fairly common health impact, maybe something like asthma. Asthma is a really nasty one. You can manage it, but the problem with asthma is that it often has onset during early in life and will follow you throughout the rest of life. And you need to stay on top of it. You can, of course, but it's a burden. And it's a burden that's borne differently, usually across different households because of things like exposure to pollution and things like that. So this is part of the reason why looking at income differences in health are a little challenging, because what you might really be seeing are early life conditions that may have traumatized health earlier on, and then have sort of bled through into things like income and health later. Okay. Finally then, so Victor Fuchs again, so he's down at Stanford and we won't hold that against him. He's a very smart guy, and he pointed this out, that time preference arguably is something that might be causing low SES and also health at the same time. Famously, there's a study of young children and marshmallows, and it's a very sadistic study in which you place marshmallows in front of children and see which children, after being told not to eat the marshmallows, which children actually eat the marshmallows versus don't eat the marshmallows. And some of them do, and some of them don't. And I'm sure it's on the internet somewhere, but I'm sure the kids who are not eating the marshmallows are going like, I want to eat the marshmallows, but I've been told not to. And so part of it is, just listening to voices of authority versus not, but part of it probably is this ability to delay gratification. This shows up all over economics. And I guess I'm not sure where we are to what extent we believe this is important, but in the broader scheme of Econ C175, I guess I would view it in the following way, that time preference and the ability to delay gratification surely reflects some part that's just biological, and some part that reflects your environment when you were young, and your family environment, the time investments of your parents into you and the other children around you, your other siblings. I don't know, suppose you think about this, like if you had a larger family and there are more of your siblings who could potentially steal your marshmallows, why would you ever leave any marshmallows on the table? You would eat them immediately, right? Because you're just gonna let your brothers or sisters steal your marshmallows from you. And I would imagine there's probably something to that, but I guess I don't know. I haven't looked at that in particular. But you would imagine that all of this is kind of stitched together in some way. Family size, the time investments into each child, the ability of children to wait and delay gratification because they can find productive uses of their time rather than instantly eat the marshmallows or whatever it is. All right, so that's the last then of these topics in the textbook. Some of the takeaways are things like this. You can find evidence for each of these theories, and each of these can explain some part probably of the socioeconomic disparities in health. Some takeaways are that there's clearly a gradient across education in particular. Even when people have the same resources, so the same insurance, the same incomes, better educated people seem to have better health. And I'd add into this, I think this is also true too about married people with better educated spouses have better health than those either who are unmarried or well, I don't know how this is going to cut exactly, but probably the thought experiment would be having a spouse with less education. It's better to have more education in the household, whether it's you or your spouse. And precisely why is kind of the open question there, but I think it's clear that is happening. The problem is, of course, for policy, what would you do about that? For own education, that makes sense. It's not obvious what you do with expanding education into a spouse, a different spouse or something. I don't know what that would look like. There's stress that's important, health events early in life, and those are important. And I think the point there is to have empathy about things. It's not so open and shut that people do bad things to their health and they end up with bad health outcomes. It's certainly not open and shut that people have health insurance and therefore behave more irresponsibly. I don't put much stock in that. I don't think there's much evidence for that, but it's something that you'll occasionally hear of example of the silly economics that arose a couple of class meetings ago. But it is important, I think, as economists to point this out, that there's a two-way relationship, there's reverse causality, and you don't always know exactly what's causing what over a life cycle. You also don't know for sure that expanding access to care is really going to be a silver bullet. I think in most cases, I think the baseline we should be taking, though, is expanding access to care is probably going to be good. And then, all right, let's assess beyond that baseline what we think might be important and what might change the ultimate punchline. A few other things too, and that is that in the economics of health, there are a lot of things that don't look particularly rational. We like to begin with rational choice, but it seems like in health there's a lot of irrationality, a lot of eating of junk food, a lot of lack of exercise, a lot of smoking and drinking. And what is that exactly? Is it a lack of time or a lack of awareness? And I think I come down on the side of it's a time constraint kind of thing. It's subpopulations who don't have the time to devote to being healthy. Okay, the next then mini topic, and I think we're going to cover this and probably have to stop, is going to be Preston's point. And so let me pause there and see if there are questions after that lengthy marathon. Why do you think that the US hasn't adopted universal health care? I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is that it's politically problematic, because a universal health care or health insurance system implies to me, unless you start adding asterisks, that whatever people currently have, they will not have anymore. I think if you talk, Obamacare is a way of patching the holes in it. So if that's what you mean by universal health care, I think that's likely to be the thing that we move in that direction, because you have to get either some gigantic cataclysm like World War II, which is what changed the British system. It's possible that COVID-19 might change our system cataclysmically in that way. I think we all hope that it doesn't. And I guess I don't really see it happening that way yet. Or you have to appeal to people politically, and you have to get a majority to actually pass something. That happened in 2008, and it might well happen again very soon. Here's Xiao Guang's question. Is there a higher time cost in countries that have universal health care, like more wait times? I think that's true. Is that kind of a disparity to accessing healthcare? Yes. And I guess the useful thing there would be to say that if you're aware of the long waits in the UK, would you then forego forego seeking healthcare because you are too impatient? You might. In our family, my wife's now departed grandmother and grandfather on that side had to have various things like hip replacements, and they waited. And they also were people of very limited education. So I don't think that's really central in the universal health insurance countries, the necessity to wait. I think the more salient thing there is the inability to get these cutting edge life-saving technologies, which might reduce length of life at the very end of life. I think that's the way things probably work there, but I don't think it's really something that matters a ton for the average outcome there. Here's Chao Chi's question. Why does mortality rise during good economic times? What I'd like to say is that, during good economic times, usually traffic accidents rise rather strongly. So that's a really clear mechanism. More trucking, more cars on the road. If you're here in the Bay Area or if you're in Los Angeles, I think you'll look out and notice that the freeways are just not as busy as they used to be. The auto insurance companies are returning dividends to policyholders because people aren't getting in car crashes right now. That's a big part of it. Okay, so we can take some more questions here. Let me just finish up the Preston curve stuff that I'd like to cover. And then next time we'll cover, sorry, this is going to be, it's going to be Raj Chetty. I'm sorry, I just blanked on his name there for a second. So he's in the slides for a little bit later, but we'll come back to that next time. So the Preston curve stuff, and so he's on the reading list. I wanted to mention because it raises this point that I'm not sure the Bhattacharya textbook does particularly well, which is to say that, you know, there's the income and health connection, and of course there's reverse causality there as well. And part of the story with incomes is that incomes buy you more nutrition, and that, I think, plausibly, is, especially in developing countries and also in historical patterns of development, that's important. But you might wonder, well, what else is important? And if what you do, like Sam Preston did in the, again, this is, you know, back in the 1970s when Gary Becker and all these, you know, all these people, Esther Boserup was writing, and, you know, by comparison, a lot of this stuff is very primitive next to what we can do today. But, you know, the basic punchlines are salient. He plotted these different eras of countries in terms of their life expectancy at birth, that's the vertical axis, and the national income per head, hilarious way of putting it, it's GDP per person, and it's in $1963, so the United States is probably the top country out here in the 1960s, I would imagine. At, you know, the great total of $1,800 just seems, it's like you basically have to pay that in rent each month, right? But this is 1963 US dollars, so there's a lot of inflation between us and them. And the point here that Preston made was that, well, here seems to be kind of a locus of points that was reflecting the 1960s and what was possible in some sense with how much health or life expectancy you could buy with the income that you had. And it was greater than what was available in the 1930s when the locus looked a little bit like this. It was at a lower level. 30 years separate those two. And of course, one of the big things that separates these two epochs in population health is the development of antibiotics, of penicillin, amoxicillin that my baby daughter and I both benefited from in battling past pneumonia. So that was the insight that things like the development of penicillin would have separated these two curves here. The penicillin was a big story in the sort of era right around World War II and thereafter. If you're a Bay Area fan, the Kaiser family foundation, the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system and all that grew out of the Kaiser shipyards and the provision of health insurance and health care through employment in the Kaiser shipyards. The Kaiser family ran the place, and they had to pump out these ships for the war effort. They also wanted very badly, of course, to keep their workers healthy, to keep the families of their workers healthy. And infectious disease was a big killer. So a great way of keeping their workers healthy was to offer health insurance through employers. So it was a natural progression into the system then that we have inherited, which I think many of us would agree is not ideal right now in the modern economy. But there's a reason that we're there, that we're here rather. And where we go next will be a function of where we are currently and what happens. So the implications are there then that you can buy more health with income. That seems sort of clear. And then it runs into diminishing returns. That shows up in the Bhattacharya textbook in a variety of ways. But you could view this as, you know, there's a flat of the curve, usually is the way it's described, that the more, you know, medical procedures and drugs that you manage to pump into somebody, you improve their survivorship, but it's not going to, you know, keep going. It'll flatten out at some point, diminishing returns, either way you want to say. That's kind of the deal. And qualitatively, it looks a lot like the Solow model, that capital gets you more income per worker, but with diminishing returns. And so capital is not in and of itself going to save you. Only technological change is actually going to really get us to the next shelf. So let me pause right there. We actually do have about enough time to do this video. We might do that next, which I think is useful, and set the table. I don't think Kaiser Permanente is a single fan from Justin. Actually, I'm a huge fan of Kaiser, I have to say. But there are people who really hate Kaiser, and to each their own, for sure. I have a high school friend whose father was a physician, and he had very negative things to say about Kaiser too. I'm a Kaiser member. I love Kaiser personally. The great thing about Kaiser is that whatever you want to have happen, they will basically do it for you within the system. And having been subjected to the awful setup of health insurance I faced in New York City, where you had a primary care physician and then you had to ask that person to refer you to everywhere else, but only within your insurance network, it was just awful. It took you forever to get care. We were talking a second ago about, say in the British system, do you have to wait for care? And the answer is absolutely. In Kaiser, most of the time not, unless it's a specialized sort of thing, like a surgery. And of course, you might have to wait for that because they don't employ a million surgeons. But if you need a referee, if you need a referral for something, maybe you need a referee too. If you need a referral for something, Kaiser could do it very quickly usually. Let me, in the time that we've got left, and it's fine if you need to sign off, let me see if this is going to work. I think what I have to do is click this. This is a fun video, and I think I've got to now click out of my screen share because I think you are not seeing my web browser. Let's check the chat thing. Okay. You've heard their stupid radio ad from Kaiser. Well, the worst radio ad from Kaiser is the Cars for Kids radio ad. That one is the worst. Okay, let's see if I can pull up Chrome here. Association between. Okay, so this, I apologize for being a bit ham-handed here. And now let's see if this is going to work. So let me know if you can hear the audio. No audio. I apologize for that. So I wonder, I'll have to research that. I'm sorry. So it looks like there's no audio coming through. You need to share computer audio when sharing your screen. Thank you, Katerina. Appreciate that. Okay, so I wonder how I do that. Let me go back here, see if I can share. I wonder where that shows up. Stop video, mute, share computer audio. Is it in the screen sharing maybe? Stop share. I just love it when I'm just completely deaf from Zoom. I'm sorry, everybody. Just pause, stop recording, share screen. So Katya's saying it's in the screen share. There we go, share computer sound. Okay, thank you so much. I apologize and thank you for staying with me because we're gonna try to do this next time also. Oh, so now Zoom is telling me I need to restart Zoom and give it a system preference, okay. I hope I'm not booted out. Oh no, am I gone? I hope not. Okay. Oh man, I'm sorry everybody, I'm just biffing this. Okay, share computer. So let me try this one more time. You're probably not having as much fun as I am.
Are associated with differences in life expectancy at age 40. They report that men in the top percentile of household income lived almost 15 years longer than those in the lowest, and women in the top percentile of household incomes lived about 10 years longer than those in the lowest. Women lived longer than men at any percentile, with the 6-year advantage among the poorest 1%, diminishing to a 1.5-year advantage for the wealthiest. Despite differences at the highest and lowest percentiles, gains in life expectancy became much less above a mean household income of about $200,000. Life expectancy at age 40 increased over the 14-year study period, an average of about 3 years for men and women in the top income quartile, compared to an average of about 1 year for those in the bottom quartile. The infamous 1% is not only richer, but much healthier, writes Nobel laureate Angus Deaton in an accompanying editorial. Individuals in the top 1% of income have 10 to 15 more years to enjoy their richly funded lives and to spend time with their children and grandchildren, and they're pulling away from everyone else. Where people live makes a difference. Life expectancy at age 40 was about 6.5 years less for the poorest men in Detroit compared to New York City, and it was about 5 years less for the poorest women in Detroit compared to New York City, between city differences that largely disappeared at the highest incomes. Nevada, Indiana, and Oklahoma had the lowest life expectancies. California, New York, and Vermont had the highest. People in the top income quartile were expected to live longest in Salt Lake City and die younger in Las Vegas, while those in the bottom income quartile were expected to live longest in New York City and die youngest in Gary, Indiana. By contrast, people in the top income quartile gained the most life expectancy over the study period in El Paso, Texas, and lost the most in Lakeland, Florida, while those in the bottom quartile gained the most in Toms River, New Jersey, and lost the most in Tampa, Florida. It's as if the top income percentiles belong to one world, the world of the elite, wealthy U.S. adults, whereas the bottom income percentiles each belong to separate worlds of poverty, each unhappy and unhealthy in its own way, writes Deaton. Health behaviors like smoking, exercise, and obesity were highly correlated with differences in life expectancy across areas, the researchers write, and they suggest that lower income individuals do better in more affluent cities with highly educated populations and high levels of government expenditures, like New York City and San Francisco. Other explanations for the observations include reverse causality, meaning poor health causes reduced income rather than the other way around, parental rather than personal income, and education. Deaton concludes, the next step is to extend the analysis by including education to advance the understanding of factors underlying the relationship between income and life expectancy. Lead author Raj Chetty concludes, we should really be thinking not just at a national level, but also at a local level about how to address life expectancy and health, because there really are big differences across places, and we should be thinking about how to change health behaviors in places like Gary, Indiana, focusing on the poor.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much. So that was that's available too in the slides if you care to click through it and watch it again. Thank you for helping me test everything and getting me on the right track. And I will see you again on Thursday. Edwards out.